Next up, far too many cases of sex trafficking go unreported, unprosecuted, remain unknown, but cases of male victims are especially likely to go unseen. A new report from GBH's Center for Investigative Reporting, called Unseen, the Boy Victims of the Sex Trade, dives deeply into some of the likely thousands of cases in Massachusetts alone, including that of Chris Bates, who was just 16 when he was lured into selling sex a decade ago.
I always thought when I was in the life, I don't think people are looking for boys. It's happening in, people's homes. It's happening everywhere, and people need to open their minds to this issue and realize it's all around us, really.
I'm joined by the two senior investigative reporters behind the story, Jenifer McKim and Phillip Martin. Congratulations to both of you. Your report's terrific. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jim.
Jenifer, let me start with you. When you hear of sex trafficking, I assume I'm not atypical. I'm embarrassed, but it's true. You think of girls, young women. How significant is the issue with boys, young men?
So you're right. Phillip Martin and I have both worked for years covering issues related to sex trafficking in the United States, including domestic sex trafficking victims. And you usually do think of girls, which is a huge problem. But what we've realized is that there is also an even more underground, harder to find problem of trafficked and exploited boys, which some studies say is as much as a third of the entire total.
Why, Phillip, why do we know so little about this?
For a lot of reasons. The reason that law enforcement focuses, you hear a lot about sex trafficking these days, but what you largely hear is focused on females for good reason. They, of course, represent the majority of those who are trafficked. But there are also boys and men who are trafficked. And there are several reasons why we don't hear about this. One is police and social service agencies don't take it as seriously. The second reason is because of toxic masculinity. Many men and boys will not admit to being trafficked. It's not something that they will admit to. It's one of those taboo topics, if you will.
Well, when you say people in law enforcement don't take it as seriously, what does that mean? That if it's a brown kid or a black kid, it's more likely that he is seen as a criminal rather than as a victim? Is that where you're going with that, Phillip?
That's precisely the case. We spoke to a number of people, and I should mention that Jenifer took the lead on part one of this series. I'm taking the lead on part two. And we, in fact, look at race in part two comprehensively. And one of the people we interviewed said you could see a car full of black youth or brown youth, and you think, wow, there's a bunch of car full of boys. But you might not think that among them is a victim. And if you see a car full of boys and a young woman, a police officer might have some inclination based on any number of factors that there's a problem here. But with the boys, with young men, it's seen as just a car full of boys. It's amorphous. And if they're black and brown, quite often they are seen in through a criminal prism, which is the prism that young black and brown boys are often seen based on any number of things, Jim.
You know, Jen, one of the two young men who you profile is this Jose Alfaro. And when I heard him say what I'm about to play, it really breaks your heart, but explains part of the infinitesimally small amount of reporting. Here is Jose Alfaro.
I didn't see myself as a victim. I saw myself as someone who participated in this business with him. And I felt like I was just as wrong as he was.
I was just as wrong as he was. That is just, how do most of these young men, boys, I guess, in so many cases, how do they get into this? So
Jose Alfaro is an amazing person, and he talks about how he felt guilty, that he was just as guilty as this person who trafficked him. He was 16 years old, and the person who was selling him was in his 30s. He was a young homeless kid who was kicked out of his home because he was gay. There's a lot of issues related to race and homophobia. Trans kids are often victimized. So people like Jose, and we spoke to another young man named Chris Bates, who was 16 also, got lured in, groomed by the internet, and started to sort of slowly get more and more involved in exploitation.
What is survival sex, Jen?
Yeah, so that's one of the things. I think that's one of the things that makes this very confusing is when you often think about trafficking, you're thinking about some person overseas being held by chains, but a lot of these issues are related to what they call survival sex, which is what happened to Jose and Chris, which they were young men. They were out on their own. They basically, the only way they felt they could survive was to be selling sex for things of value. And under the federal government, sex trafficking, it's considered sex trafficking if you're under the age of 18 and trading sex for something of value like a home or food.
You know, Phillip, I know you mentioned that Jenifer did most of part 1. You'll be doing part 2, which airs Monday. Can you tell us a little bit about Jason Velasquez?
Sure. Jason Velasquez is actually featured in part 1 and an upcoming series that Jenifer and I are working on. But that's no problem. But I will let her talk about Velasquez. However, you may want to talk about, there's another person we interview in this series. His name is Fillmore. That's his last name, Dr. Fillmore. He's a man with a PhD who was once trafficked in Chicago, who endured a lifetime, and I mean literally a lifetime, of sexual abuse predicated largely on race. And he was essentially trafficked in Chicago. And one of the issues the issues that ties all of this in, Jim, to your other question of how people get into this, the intricate relationship between poverty and trafficking. And with a number of these individuals, almost everyone you'll meet in this series who has been trafficked and as a survivor, they started off homeless, and they were homeless because either they lost their homes through being racially ostracized, or because they were gay, or for any number of factors where they were essentially thrown out, cast aside.
You know, Jenifer, I will follow the advice of Phillip and ask you about Jason Velasquez. I don't have much time, but tell me a little bit about his story.
So briefly, Jason Velasquez was laid off last year as a construction worker. He also has suffered sexual assault as a younger person, and he started something called Predators, Poachers, Massachusetts, in which he pretends to be a young child and then basically goes and sort of humiliates people who are trying to predators who are trying to go after young people. And then he provides that information to police. And in one case that we looked at, he actually ended up leading to charges to the former police chief of Stowe, Massachusetts, a small town in Massachusetts.
You know, speaking of leading the charges, one of the most depressing parts of this story, and the eye-opening part of it is huge, is, Phillip, when I read that most of these trafficking and exploitation cases are dismissed. Why? Why?
For any number of reasons, Jim. Sometimes the witnesses don't come forward. Sometimes it's hard to prove a trafficking case for the reasons that Jenifer mentioned, when it seems like there is some reciprocal transactional condition. But those transactional conditions, of course, should not apply if someone's under the age of 18. Under the age of 18, it's technically trafficking. So what you mainly find are a lot of young people won't come forward, especially young men. They do not want to be identified. They're already traumatized. And getting them to speak about this, and we found this out in this series, getting young men to speak about what has happened to them is very problematic for them. They feel they're ostracized not just as victims and survivors, and won't be seen as victims and survivors, but would have a hard time with the, if you will, toxic masculinity permeating many communities across the board.
Jenifer, last minute, Maura Healey is apparently earnestly trying to change this dynamic, no?
Right, exactly. I mean, she's been working on, or her office has been working on issues of sex trafficking for the last decade. They've filed 62 cases over this time period, but yet only one of them has had a male victim. And that is a concern that she sees and is something that she wants to do more. I mean, first of all, we're not seeing enough of the young women either, but boys are even farther underground.
Well, let me just tell you, as I said at the beginning, I'll say again, this is an eye-opening a series that everybody has an obligation to check out. Wonderful reporting, and thank you for your time, both of you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your interest.